Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be opening today's session on the role of governments, policymakers, and finance in building green infrastructure. This is the latest in our series of events on this topic as part of the OMFIF Sustainable Policy Institute, which we launched in September. We're very pleased to be partnering also with the British Embassy in Madrid on this event. We have a great set of conversations to be had today from the UK, from Spain, and beyond, on opportunities for green infrastructure. There is a big emphasis in the recovery to build back better, and green infrastructure is a key asset class in that process. It's a great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker to give the welcome address today. So we have the Lord Mayor of London, William Russell, who's at the end of September been reappointed to the position of Lord Mayor of London. Congratulations, and also has many years of experience in the asset management industry, also in fintech and innovation. So very, very pleased to welcome you. Over to you.
It's a pleasure to join you all today. To say the least, the last 12 months have been a challenging time for us all. Every aspect of our daily lives has been interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. But as the promise of a vaccine switches from dream to reality, there is renewed focus on the future. As we begin to look forward, we must ask ourselves not only how do we build back the global economy, but how do we build it back better? That question has dominated my discussions over recent months, and there is one answer that has come up time and time again: ESG investing. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown yet again that ESG is not only prudent, but profitable, and one of the best tools available to governments and the market to address social issues, especially climate change. Thinking has accelerated, and more people are now recognizing the importance of sustainable finance. To make sustainable financing a success, every sector of the economy must be involved. A transformation is required in each country, from developed markets to emerging economies to unrated and frontier nations. The UK government already recognized this before the pandemic, announcing the Sustainable Infrastructure Fund at the UK Africa Investment Summit earlier this year, a fantastic opportunity for commercial investors to partner with government. 2021 will be a landmark year for global climate action as we look to COP26 hosted in Glasgow. It will be crucial to green the economy and make sustainable investments addressing climate change and accelerating the global recovery. Over the past few months, I've been delighted to see so many net zero commitments and sustainable investment ambitions emerging from local authorities across the UK and other organisations globally. And more recently, the willingness of business and government to create a green future was reaffirmed through the Green Horizon Summit, a key event on the road to COP26. Backed by the Green Finance Institute and the World Economic Forum and hosted here in the City of London, the summit was a global gathering of over 100 political leaders, financial regulators, CEOs, and green finance practitioners. Over 3,000 delegates attended from over 90 different countries, and it was watched by tens of thousands more. The summit finished with a core message: the world is counting on financiers to make every effort to mobilize capital to a net zero transition now, and to ensure that our recovery is a green one. As Mark Carney shared on day one, every financial decision needs to take climate change into account. We were proud to see the summit used as a launch pad for an array of initiatives, showing the financial sector's commitment to a greener future. Mark Carney launched the Private Finance Strategy for COP26, and UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced landmark steps to maintain the UK's global green finance leadership. Among these was a UK sovereign green bond, which will be issued in 2021, with a plan to build a green sovereign yield curve. Meanwhile, from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, came the announcement that the much anticipated climate stress tests will commence in June 21. On the private side, important steps are also being taken. In collaboration with the TCFD, for instance, Generation Investment Management co-founder David Blood released a new report on measuring portfolio alignment with the Paris Agreement. which is an absolute must read for any asset managers. For our finance ministers, on the other hand, I'd highly recommend reading Mike Bloomberg's and the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative's consultation on investment considerations for attracting private finance to emerging markets. All these initiatives and announcements show how we in the financial services industry have a clear strategy to net zero. The need now is to shift from strategy into execution. London is exceptionally well placed to lead the way on this. The key virtues that make the City of London the world's premier financial centre is such as depth of capital markets, the rule of law, and international standards, coupled with strong policy leadership and a powerful innovation ecosystem, put London ahead of the curve. London has long been a global leader in ESG. We are consistently ranked as either the best or one of the best financial centres in the world for green finance. And we are home to innovative, world-first green products, a full spectrum of green financial and professional services, and high-profile thought leaders. The London Stock Exchange was the first to issue certified green bonds from China, India, and the Middle East, while $26 billion has been raised overall in green bonds to date. Most of all, our ecosystem includes the unique Green Finance Institute, a convening point for climate scientists, policymakers, and financial leaders to forge global standards in sustainable finance. And the recently published report by the City of London places the green transition at its heart, prioritizing infrastructure investment, firms' own green transitions, and nurturing the development of green finance expertise as key to London's recovery from COVID-19. The City of London Corporation itself is also leading the charge through our own strategy and commitments. We set to achieve net zero in the City Corporation's own operations by 2027, and by 2040 we should be net zero across the corporation's full value chain. In fact, we have a history here. Back in 1954, under the Clean Air Act, we were the first city to abolish coal fires. Climate resilience in our buildings, public spaces, and infrastructure are all crucial parts of this. We will also be improving energy efficiency in investment and corporate properties and are aligning our investment portfolio with the Paris Agreement, while also enhancing carbon removal in our open spaces, protecting shared natural resources, and driving net zero through our supply chain. As I said, looking forward, we aim to achieve a net zero across the square mile by 2040. We are working with all stakeholder groups to accelerate this transition, especially supporting SMEs to reach net zero. And having seen the dramatic changes in weather across the globe, we are also continuing to invest in making the square mile more resilient to extreme climates. Ladies and gentlemen, quite simply, the time is now to act on climate change. It is the responsibility of every individual and sector to play their part in the transition to net zero. The financial sector has outlined its steps to a greener future. Now we must put those steps into action, working with competitors and stakeholders across the industry and around the world, all to finance the greenest economic transition of our time. There is much work to be done, and I'm confident that together we will achieve our ambitions. I now call myself the Green Lord Mayor, and instead of the yellow brick road to Glasgow, it's the green brick road to Glasgow. Let us move forward. We have no time to waste. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very strong message of moving from strategy to execution. And I think that is very much the guiding principle on the way to Glasgow and COP26. And as you mentioned as well, we had the COP in Madrid last year, and that was a very different world around this time last year. One can think that just a year has passed since then. And together with the British Embassy in Madrid, we actually published a report at the time looking at the opportunities for the UK and Spain as Spain was giving passing on the baton to the UK for green investments and putting climate change at the heart of policy. As you said, a lot has been done in the UK. The commitment to net zero, and also the green bond as well, which is the latest country to be joining the club of issuers in the green bond space. Also, you mentioned that every individual, every actor has to act on climate change. A lot of questions around what should be the balance between governments, the private sector, how can these actors work together, and also what can be the innovation that we can see in the finance side. So I'm very pleased to welcome our first panel to address some of these questions on the role of governments and policymakers in building green infrastructure. So if you can start entering the virtual room, we have Raffaele Della Croce, a senior economist at the OECD and the G20, Raul Rosales, Senior Executive Fellow at the Center for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College Business School. Welcome. We have Mike Tehetmeyer, Partner, Capital Markets Technology and Sustainable Finance Leader at EY, and also Matthew Jordan Tang, Director and Head of Sustainable Infrastructure Policy and Project Preparation for the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So let me start with you, Matthew. And the EBRD, you recently published your annual transition report, and we've all seen various presentations of that. And the theme of it was the state strikes back, which is quite a kind of big headline there. So we are talking here about the role of governments, of policymakers in green infrastructure. What do you think that balance should be? And also tell us a little bit about the practical kind of examples from BRD's work in various countries, what kind of projects you are seeing, how do you see the green economy transition happening, and also the role of particular sectors within infrastructure, from solar to transport, because there's very different discussions in terms of developed countries, for example, on how they're transitioning, the balance between focusing on mitigation and adaptation when it comes to investments, and some of the more developing or emerging frontier markets that you're operating in as the EBRD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danae. And let me thank the organizers from OMFIF, the Sustainable Policy Institute. It's a real pleasure to be here representing EBRD and to share the stage with this distinguished panel and indeed the Lord Mayor, really following on from those excellent comments and remarks. So let me address some of the questions you raised by outlining the approach we take. Focusing on the sustainable infrastructure area, where I'm a director for policy and project preparation. You know, at EBRD, we've always been about projects. We've always been about the leveraging also of forward-thinking policies through our investments. We do about 10 billion euros a year in lending across 400 projects. So you can gather from that we are deeply engaged at the project level, the specific investments. But we recognize that there are huge challenges out there, and indeed, first and foremost, really is this imperative. This imperative to work on the green economy transition. So the bank has been strong in this area for a number of years, but we've just upped the ante. In October, our board approved, with our governor's support, our new updated and more ambitious green economy transition approach, which essentially sets a 50% plus target of all lending that EBRD does going forward. So that will be well over 5 billion euros a year over the next period, and we're extremely happy to push the envelope on the green agenda. As I said, sustainable infrastructure is at the heart of what we do in trying to help meet the SDGs, our client countries, our clients, private and public, and also align with Paris. I think alignment with the Paris Agreement will be a very big topic and theme and focus of work over the next year at EBRD, as well as across the multilateral development banks who are coalescing around this with a joint methodology. So you'll need to watch that space because it's important. I'd like to describe,
how much kind of coordination are you seeing? Because Paris is a useful framework because it helps everyone align behind the same goal. But what we hear a lot about sustainable finance is that there's different approaches in different countries. As a bank operating in various jurisdictions, how do you see that? Do you think it's important and Paris is helpful?
Yeah. So thank you. I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of discussion that's happening in what I would call the sort of third bucket. There are certainly sectors and types of projects that are clearly Paris aligned. There are others that are in sort of an exclusion list. I mean, for example, EBRD does not lend in coal any longer. And that's kind of quite a consensus across the MDBs, not quite 100%, but getting there. And then there are some sectors, particularly in the transport sector, which are dependent on fossil fuels and have been traditionally, where we're really seeking to improve the way these projects are developed, develop pathways towards alignment. You can think of roads, for example, and the concept of EV-ready roads, hydrogen-ready roads. I mean, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of pre-planning and design needs to go into that? How do you engage with the private sector to make those investments in fast charging infrastructure, for example? So those are the types of areas. In fact, e-mobility is really a key feature of our green economy transition because it is such an important area, and we're doing a lot there to not only finance the infrastructure, the charging, but also fleets, both private and public, for public transport, commercial fleets, and getting the balance of private versus public right. And I think that's really important because there are real areas of private sector investment that need to happen as a complement to the public infrastructure. I'd just like to finish because I know we have a lot of great speakers coming, but another really flagship initiative for us is the EBRD Green Cities framework approach. And we've got 43 cities to date. It centers around green city action plans where there's deep stakeholder engagement to build up a consensus for the long-term, short-term, medium, and long-term goals, building in sort of distilling out what is truly a low-carbon approach for cities going forward. We have an ambition to get to 100 cities by 2023. It's a 2 billion euro framework, one of the largest in the bank. And we really think it's a great way to sort of galvanize support around public support for mayors to push forward with green investments. So I'll stop there and really happy to participate in the panel. Thank you.
Very much follow up on in our discussion, and very interesting to hear about cities as well. It is a green city, and I'll move to Rafael next. And at the OECD, you've published also another report, the Business and Finance Outlook, where you have a focus on sustainable and resilient finance. And you've written there about ESG and institutional investment in infrastructure. So tell us a little bit about that, about how do you see it at the OECD? Matthew just spoke now about having the right balance between the private sector and the complement public investment in infrastructure. How does that align with the OECD's thinking, where you have published a lot about public investment, the importance of fiscal policy and investing in infrastructure as a way to building the recovery? So tell us a little bit your view on that, and also maybe the investor perspective that you're seeing in your conversation of investing in infrastructure specifically.
Sure. Thank you, Dani. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Definitely the publication you mentioned, the Business and Finance Outlook, was focusing this year on sustainability and resilience in financial markets. And the part I've been covering was very much related to infrastructure and ESG, and the view from investors, the network of investors we monitor and we work with at the OECD. And the starting point of this analysis was the recognition that to deliver quality infrastructure, we need community support and, in other words, the social license to operate. At the same time, there is an investor appetite, very strong, and this is due to ESG sort of recognition, getting more and more there about the importance of preserving value and the risk management of their assets, about their future investment opportunities. This is the push from investors coming from the need to invest to match their long-term liabilities. So it's about the low yield environments, the current macro context we are living in, and we're gonna live for some time, and the impossibility for funds to actually deliver on their promises. And also on the social pressure that we see from the members of the retirement system themselves. So a big appetite from investors, but at the same time, we see a big...
Just on that demand side for investors, because you mentioned a few kind of push factors there. You mentioned the kind of needs for return in the low yield environment, but also the kind of social pressures from the ultimate shareholders and the kind of owners of these assets. But what do you think is the balance in these motivations? Is it more a business case? Is it kind of that reputational and stakeholder kind of importance? Is it also regulation? Because some pension funds, for example, are being asked to align their portfolios with certain goals or to divest from certain sectors. What do you think are the main drivers there in how you see it?
Well, there are two sets of challenges that we identified. One is set of challenges is related to the market structure. And the other one is about the maturity of the ESG as an asset class, as infrastructure as an asset class. On the market structure, there is a misunderstanding about the channels through which investors are accessing infrastructure. So the private market trends and through which the infrastructure market financing has been developing over the last 20 years or so, which got us to over 600 billion of asset under management in infrastructure, starting from a very low number. At the same time, there are trends in the sustainable area, in this ESG area, over which impact investing, sustainable strategies, green strategies are other channels through which sustainability infrastructure is receiving funds and attention from investors. And those kind of channels have major challenges in terms of the gatekeepers, which are the asset managers, the large asset managers. On one side, very potentially proactive and capabilities to provide opportunities for investors, the asset owners, matching the long-term horizon sustainability willingness. At the same time, creating a misalignment in terms of what the products are in the market and what investors really want. And so the mismatch in terms of appetite and opportunities in the market is a major issue that we identify. Another one is the maturity in terms of data, evidence, empirical analysis on those assets, from an understanding of where does it sit in the portfolio allocation to the performance of the ESG connected to financial performance. What is the financial materiality of ESG factors these days is still a big question mark. So in order to fix these challenges, the work that we are involved with the OECD through the G20 is very much along these two major areas of work, and in collaboration with all our other stakeholders, all the other MDBs and private sector as well, goes in the direction of what is the model for long-term patient capital keen to get a sustainable purpose to invest to financial markets in infrastructure. And there are different models of collaboration with institutional investors. There is the important role of infrastructure banks or green banks. There is listed vehicles, so we won't have the time here to go. Securitization is something we touch upon. All this, I think, goes in the direction of creating a secondary market for institutional investors, which is still a big conundrum for the way we see it. The other set of solutions, which are very much related to the G20 and COP opportunity that we see for next year, G20 work, which will be led by Italy, and the COP by the UK in partnership with Italy as well, is on getting more data and evidence out, leveraging the existing data initiatives which are there, G20 or not G20. Regulators have a big role in pushing this, although of course we cannot rely just on them to get to the next stage.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and very important also you raised the importance of data and evidence, and I think that's a good bridge to you, Mike, as well, from EY, to tell us a little bit about how do you see it from a kind of more private sector perspective and the financial services organizations that work with. Rafael spoke about the financial materiality aspects. How advanced are we in terms of how financial institutions are understanding the risks in their portfolios, measuring them, and also understanding materiality both ways, not just what the climate and ESG factors are doing to their portfolios, but also how they're impacting these factors long term. And in terms of data and evidence, the OMFIS Sustainable Policy Institute, we published together with Refinitiv a report in September looking exactly at that and kind of how developments in technology are allowing us to access data more directly without having to necessarily rely on disclosures from companies themselves. But of course, there is a whole Mark Carney agenda that the Lord Mayor spoke about at the very start as well. And the work of the FSB and the TCFD, we're now seeing a TNFD as well on nature and kind of how that may be aligned to the infrastructure. Over to you, how do you see these issues around data, reporting, and understanding reality in financial institutions' portfolios?
Thank you, and obviously a pleasure to be here. Excuse me. So, as is always the case, catches you just before you start. So, finance has as Lord Mayor highlighted, plays an absolutely key role in being able to finance projects. So I just want to bring that to life as to why financial services are critical to this. So on the back of the European Union's Green Deal announced in July, EY did some analysis around the projects that need financing and what the potential benefit of those projects are. Because I think that what that will do is help crystallize why financial services and how financial services have a role to play in this, and how disclosures are important, and assessment of the risk. So we looked at 2,000 projects across the 27 member states to look at where they had a sustainability or investment opportunities for a green outcome, and we defined them as shovel ready. So of those 2,000, we identified 1,000 of those that would be ready in the next 2 years, next 24 months, to create some social, environmental, and economic value over that period of time. Now, the interesting thing for me was that those projects are at the point where they're at the last stage of being able to getting that last push over to being ready to be able to deliver some of that value. And they're at the point where they need some additional financing, or to be able to come over some additional barriers to be able to come to life and deliver the value. So just to crystallize what the opportunity of those projects represent. So across the European Union, those projects currently represent the opportunity, with an investment of around 200 billion, if we're distributed across those 27 countries, would represent the opportunity to generate 2.3 million FTEs, or equivalent to around about 3 million jobs. So, which represent about a quarter of the jobs that are being lost for COVID-19. So the opportunity here is that there is financing that is needed to be able to support those projects and deliver the benefit, not only from employment, but also the green credentials. And if I sort of give you an idea of the type of green credentials that they represent, the sort of, they represent the opportunity to be able to deliver 2.3 gigatons of carbon, lower carbon over the life of those projects. They represent obviously the jobs, but also their ancillary benefits, and the Lord Mayor talked about those, which is things like better, lower impact environment, but also better quality of air within the cities. And they're covering energy, transport, buildings, industry, and land use. Now, at the core of that is, how do we get access to that 200 billion euros of finance to be able to support it? There is clearly a role for private finance to be able to support it. So in the case of private finance, the banks are now recognizing that they have a role to play. And a part of that is coming from the clearly driven by the Bank of International Settlement through TCFD, and by the central banks collaborating together. Obviously here 2 weeks ago, on the back of the Green Horizon Summit, some really important announcements are made around disclosures and reporting. So one of the challenges we face today is, from financial services, is how the data that we use to be able to inform our decision making as to how do we invest in these types of projects going to deliver that benefit across these 1,000 shovel-ready projects. The data we use is very poor. That we don't have information around the projects themselves. So one of the challenges we've got is, how do you get information about the project? How do you get confidence around a project about the outcome, the benefit they're going to deliver? You also have another challenge, which is, how do we get confident in the businesses that we are investing in, and the projects, that they are businesses that are genuinely going to be sustainable and transitioning to be able to support us to move to a lower carbon, more sustainable future. And that data is a challenge.
On the quality of the data, do you think, because you mentioned kind of the role of banks, and do you think that the way forward is for these kind of disclosures to become mandatory? What's your view on that? And also, you mentioned the kind of Bank for International Settlements and the regulation side. Do you think that there is a room for the kind of Basel rules to reflect some of these green capital requirements? What's your view on that question?
So, disclosure, and Mark Carney's been very clear about that, disclosure for reporting is critical, not just on the bank side to say, what are we financing, but also on the companies that are being invested in. So the UK has committed to mandate TCFD reporting here in the UK by 2025, which is absolutely critical. 60 other jurisdictions around the globe have made similar types of commitments, maybe not quite as hard as both the UK and New Zealand have done. But I believe that we will be moving that direction. Now, that's already happening on a voluntary basis. So if you look at, investors are asking these questions. Investors want to understand what companies are doing to be able to transition. So there's both a regulatory drive, but there's also investor drive. And I think that investor drive is critical because investors have as much impact. And over probably the last 12 months, I think it's moved from it being regulatory driven as the majority driver to probably an evenly between the regulators, the investors, but also firms themselves recognizing that they have a broader role within society to be able to support not just a shareholder, but broader stakeholders. And you've seen from big organizations like BlackRock who are making that commitment and also supporting that change in the market. Now, the financial services are now using that information, that disclosures, to be able to support decision-making around investing in these projects. The question you ask around how is it going to impact the overall capital structures, that is still to be worked out. But it's very interesting in the conversations I have with chief risk officers and members of risk boards, they're of an opinion that climate risk is going to be something that will become, here in the UK, we've already said it has to become part of your risk framework by the end of next year. We will see that type of risk being embedded in other jurisdictions as well. I hear from risk officers, and I agree with them, that we will be moving to a model where climate risk and carbon specifically in relation to climate risk will become something that is actually treated in the same way that we have credit limits, we will have carbon limits. So that within financial services, when you make a financial decision, you need to understand not only what the financial risk is you're running, but you need to understand initially in the case of what the climate risk is, driven by carbon, because you can measure it, but we will move over time to be able to understand what the broader environmental impacts are. And I think that ultimately will start reflecting in the underlying capital that will be accounted for within financial services. Now, if you go to the real economy will also need to start making decisions around their understanding of carbon within their business. So I'm an advocate where you have a CFO or a treasurer looking at working capital. They now also need to start thinking about what is their working carbon as they make operational decisions and funding decisions for their business. They need to start factoring in what is the carbon implications of that, because they're going to have to be able to justify that and explain that to the financial services firms that are funding their organization going forward.
Thank you, Mike. Very important also that two-way materiality, and also you spoke a lot about risk, but here we're talking also about the sustainable infrastructure investments, about the opportunities as well, because that's also a two-way way to see that. And the climate stresses, a lot of the regulation is focusing a lot on the risk, on protecting portfolios from the risk, but how do we account also for the investments that financial services organizations are making and how those go together? Rafael also spoke earlier about the transition as well and helping organizations transition. Let's move to Raul now, and that will kind of complete the first round of the panel. So a reminder to our audience to also send us questions if you have any. A lot has been referenced already. So Raul, welcome as well to the panel. And kind of synthesizing, we've heard from the private sector side, we've heard from international organizations, kind of on your side, more from the academic environment and studying this, how do you reflect on these questions, on the role of governments, but also on kind of financing green infrastructure? What may be the role of finance there, and how do we measure risk, and what role does infrastructure investment play in accounting for that risk?
Okay, Dana, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the opportunity with this audience and with the honorary Mayor of London. So let me highlight like a few things, because I really think it's all about policy initiatives and policy making and regulation. A recent study that I did just a few months ago about, for instance, the impact of IFRS 9 on project finance portfolio portfolios in European bank, in this case with an exposure of default. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very concrete with key messages in this brief discussion. Exposure of default of 6.9 million euro of portfolio. Transactions in stage 2, for instance, presents a probability of default of 6.8%. When we transform this kind of portfolio into a lifetime PD probability of default, this PD rises to 27% because of the lifetime factor. So what does it mean? What it means is that the project finance portfolios hold the larger multiplier or lifetime factor due to the high average maturity of these portfolios. And because the main driver of this kind, the calculation of the PDs, which is the key point, is the maturity. But my point is that regulation, in terms of the accounting regulation with IFRS 9, which for project finance and specialty lending, which is the financial tool for banks to finance infrastructure, IFRS 9 impact is huge for banks. And also the capital requirements. For instance, the slotting criteria, as you know very well, the IRB average is 80% density of risk-weighted assets. And under the standard approach, this is 100%. This is the other driver. It's all about risk-weighted assets for banks, but also for investors as well. So we need to know where we are coming from, where we are. We are talking about regulation. It's all about that. And but we have to think about what's happening with this kind of crisis with the COVID as well. What's happening with upcoming regulation with Basel IV, just in a few months, 1 year, a year and a half. So, for instance, as you know as well, the CRR2 made changes. The capital requirements regulations, number 2, coming up with Basel IV, made some changes, and to regulation concerning the adjustment of own funds requirements for non-defaulted SME exposures. How? Introducing what is this called the SME supporting factor, okay? And it introduced a new adjustment to own fund requirements for exposures to entities that operate or finance physical structures of special networks for essential public services, introducing the infrastructure supporting factors. So the CRR made 2 key changes, which is this SME supporting factor and the infrastructure supporting factor. However, in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, because citizens continue providing this lending and they are struggling with the regulation and with NPLs and plenty of things that happen, is that this date of up to made changes, they have been advanced. So now these supporting factors of 0.75% is applied to these credit risk exposures for SMEs and specialty lending for transport and energy. These are real and very concrete measures that help to provide a lending to the infrastructure sector. Just in conclusion, just to give a clue about what we are talking about, the new regulation, which allows applying a supporting factors for SMEs and specialty lending of 0.75%, enable banks to save between 5 and 15 basis points of core equity tier 1. As you can imagine, this is critical. We are talking about that. More about, for instance, policy initiatives, capital requirements, because it's, again, I'm sorry, it's all about this. It's about the data, it's about the taxonomy, it's the risk-weighted assets, and it's about capital and capital allocation at the end of the day. I would like to mention 2 very important initiatives coming up in the past 2 years from the European Commission. One was this, that you know as well, this action plan for sustainable growth, financing sustainable growth from 2018. Also the recent one from this kind of policy initiatives related to climate-related financial risks and financial stability from May 2019. In both plans, financing sustainable growth 18 and 19, the Commission explored the feasibility of inclusion of climate-related risk in banks' capital requirements or in the capital requirements framework. It doesn't matter. So this is what they are doing. And the idea of a green supporting factor, which is a risk weight reduction in the prudential framework, as we mentioned before, with this kind of 0.75% for banks' exposures to green assets. Well, this is something that we are working with this right now. One of my suggestions for policy
just to ask you a little bit on that, because the argument in kind of introducing a green supporting factor from the regulator's perspective is that we don't have enough evidence to support that green also means free, and another approach maybe to have a brown penalizing factor for brown sectors. At the same time, to have the considerations around supporting sectors in transition that we heard from Matthew and Rafael earlier. There is also the other side of thinking about it, which is, yes, we don't have the data yet, we don't have the evidence to show that correlation between credit risk and greenness of an asset, but we also don't have enough time to wait to gather that evidence, because climate change is a very urgent problem that we're facing. Where do you lie on that kind of these opposite sides of the spectrum, perhaps? Do we have enough time? Do we make the perfect the enemy of the good, or do we still have to focus more on brown penalizing factors and focusing on the transition, given where we are?
Okay, Dana, thank you very much. That's a very good question, but I have to say something. We do have time. It is not true. This is something urgent. Climate risk, climate-related financial risk. This is a real risk, but we do have time. We must have time to do the things properly. And I would suggest to the Commission and also to policymakers and regulators to explore the brown risk factor as well, not only the green risk factor. And whatever we do, it has to be risk-based approach, 100%. There is no another way to do that. And we look, it does mean that we have to look for the evidence that green investments or green assets are less risky than non-green or brown assets. And I have to say there is no proof of evidence that it is not clear that these non-green or green are less riskier than brown assets. And we have to do well our homework. We have to do well as also regulators, the EBA, and everybody. We have to do this, again, risk-based approach. I have to say something as well, Dana, which is extremely important, the taxonomy. The taxonomy, the green taxonomy, the brown taxonomy, the non-classified, this is critical. This is the first step. And we need to have a level playing field. And we have the threat of politicians and politics. For instance, think about the UK with this kind of a cliff with Brexit. What is the UK with the taxonomy about that? Are they aligned? Are they on the same page with the European Union, the European Commission taxonomy? They must be on the same page. Otherwise, it will be a mess. Why? Because we have to tackle all of us a risk-based approach. That's the point. That's one thing.
Thank you, Raul. We're coming towards the end for this panel. I think we could have a whole other panel for the issue of taxonomy. It's a very big topic, and also good that we are having this discussion where we're having Spain and the UK and others represented, because as you say, having a common framework is one approach, adapting it to local context and local framework, especially for countries that have different market setups with more state-owned enterprises or SMEs, is also another approach. But thank you very much to everyone in the panel, in the first panel of today's session, for joining us. Very interesting conversations. I think we could have gone on for much longer, but also please do read the reports that were referenced here. Matthew and the transition report, Rafael and the sustainable finance report of the OECD, and Mike cited some very interesting stats as well from the work that EY did in the summer. So thank you all for bringing in all these facts and figures and your experiences as well today. I'd like now to introduce our second panel for focusing more specifically on green infrastructure, the main investment trends and attractiveness. And actually, it's a very good bridge from what Raul was saying just now. So we have 4 panelists: Carlos Sanchez, Director of Climate Resilience Investment at Wills Towers Watson. We have Jose Maria Roldan, Chairman and CEO of the Spanish Banking Association. We have Esteban Abad, Partner at Three Hills Capital Partners, and Felipe Martinez, Board Director for Spain and Mexico at the EBRD. So let's start with you, Felipe, actually. And Raul was speaking just now about the role of standards, the taxonomy. So it would be good to kind of see how you, as a supranational development bank, issuers in your universe who are approaching this, and how you're seeing the kind of filling the gap with green energy, green innovation funding, and also setting standards when you're operating across various jurisdictions.
Well, thank you for this question, Dana, and thank you for your invitation to be today here. I think for supranationals, there has been an ongoing debate. We started this market in issuing green references back in 2007, and we have tried to adapt ourselves so as to crowd in as much as possible private finance, because it is needed. I mean, sovereigns and supranationals do not have enough firepower to fill the gap, and at the same time be an active player and to lead by example in different opportunities. Our key task now, and bridging with what Raúl was saying, was leading by example, maybe not just in innovating new references, which is what we have done in the past, but probably in risk management. This is a way ahead that is opening up, and where we will have to lead in good practices to the private sector, probably engaging with the results of the task force for financial climate disclosure and how we apply it to our balance sheets. And I would say there are other parts in terms of leading by example where we can be key in unlocking the private sector. What I read recently from the Bank of International Settlements is that the evidence at hand is that companies, they are doing a big effort to put new references on the market in terms of their issuances, but it is doubtful if these individual references do have a complete firm impact in terms of abatement of emissions or in terms of climate resilience, and not only in terms of the firm umbrella, but also on the whole structure of the economies. And in these supranationals, we do fill the gap in the sense that we have this tool of policy dialogue with firms, and whenever we engage in their activity to put paper in the market, we covenant all our interventions when we go with them and issue paper, so that it has a broader impact, our intervention, than just an issuance, but on the whole firm and on the economy. On the economic, because also we reach
the side as well. Because what we hear a lot from the investment community and the asset owners is that there is still not enough supply. I mean, you were the EIB and others were kind of the first to enter that market with green bond issuances over 10 years ago now, but still it's a very small part of the market. So how do you go about increasing the pipeline, increasing the supply? Kind of what do you see the main barriers to doing that from an issuer's perspective when you think about enhancing infrastructure as an asset class or issuing more fixed income products in that side? Because is it that there is not enough projects? It's hard to find the pipeline behind it to back, for example, the issuance of bonds that are focused on that? Is it that the regulations are not there? Because demand is not really an issue. Everyone wants to buy sustainable bonds, and especially from supranationals and development banks, they are in very, very hot demand. So why are we not seeing enough supply?
Well, in a sense, you know, there is a gap there that it is very difficult with public funds to fill in. Our best effort is to learn by doing. So we do have issuances in the size of our balance sheet, and if we want to grow bigger, our key impact has to be in making projects bankable. And making projects bankable means allowing countries and operators in the countries interested in developing infrastructure projects that are bankable in the sense that have the technology, for instance, that provides useful data that to meet traffic data or peak load information that makes projects more amenable to market interest. And that's our key role in policy dialogue.
With Spain and Mexico. And in Mexico, they have this Proyectos Mexico for infrastructure projects, this website where you can see exactly what infrastructure projects are in the pipeline. We've worked very closely with the Banco de Mexico on this, and they are quite a good example for the rest of the world on that. So that may be a way to kind of produce a pipeline. How do you see something like that working in Europe? We are here talking about the UK and Spain, and there is huge infrastructure needs, not as much as in emerging markets, of course, but still kind of upgrading the infrastructure networks. How do you see that experience from Mexico, perhaps something that we can learn from?
I think it is perfectly exportable. Obviously, the EBRD doesn't invest in Mexico. We are well of this development. And I think this is the critical game changer that supranationals can provide in countries that are recipient of these private funds to construct infrastructure, in building the gap in these terms of information, in these terms of giving chips that are interesting for private investors. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move to you, Carlos, next. So it would be great to hear from you on the initiatives that you've been working on, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and how do you see from the investor's perspective, we also had a question from the audience on kind of what are the returns for investors in this sector? How do you see that kind of discussion happening in your experience so far?
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you everyone for the invitation. Fantastic discussion so far. I hope I can really contribute to what has been a really, really good flow. So to your question, and actually I think that point about the return or the return, a risk-adjusted return profile that we have for certain types of investment is a critical one, and it's at the heart of this Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. Basically, this is a coalition that brings the leadership of the global private finance industry in a commitment to advance practical solutions that allows us to better integrate or better price physical climate risk in investment decision making, and of course with a primary focus on infrastructure and real assets. So basically, the way that we interpret or put in practice this mandate is to have different working groups. So we have one working group, and actually I think that the conversation has strongly resonated with that, is working with governments, and is working with governments to facilitate how they can better understand what are the top priority projects in a given jurisdiction, in a given time horizon, where the most economic and social value is protected from physical climate risk in that given time horizon. So in other words, helping them make the economic case to invest in resilience. How many units of economic and social value every unit invested is generating? That is, of course, very different from the question from investors about the risk-adjusted return. And that is where we have a different working group, where what we are doing is advancing a framework for an agreed upon standards for the integration of climate risk data into the different lines and the different columns contained within a valuation, an asset valuation model. So basically, really going and tackling the key considerations that really affect free cash flows from an investment standpoint, and that ranges from revenue projections, so how macroeconomic consideration and indicators are going to be affected and therefore impacting directly, as in lesser revenue, but also indirectly, as in the underlying assumptions for the discounting of future cash flows. Engineering considerations from a pure CapEx, OpEx standpoint. And then we got to the heart of this question. And I really liked how every contribution has really been pointed to the same direction. That is, we need to find a perfect proven correlation of integration of climate risk with credit quality consideration, because that is the needle that at the end of the day is going to move the whole narrative. And I agree that there are challenges, and data is at the heart of any challenge, particularly in physical climate risk, where we really depend on a relatively accurate projection on how certain hazards are going to grow in terms of incidence, in terms of frequency and severity, and how those are going to translate into my cash flow model. So that is a tremendous challenge, but there are many advancements that really allows us to be quite optimistic. I just wanted to bring a one key consideration that is even before everything that I said, that is, what is the driver for action and involvement from now 63 institutions adding to 10 trillion in assets? And of course, there is a strong commitment from a pure, let's say, ESG perspective to really be supportive to global efforts. But then there is also a consideration about what is perceived to be evaluation risk, and that is, there is a recognition that given the fantastic progress in regulatory initiatives, and I think that there's been a fantastic outlining of the key initiatives there, but given that progress, given the progress that rating agencies are making in recognizing and better integrating these considerations, and given the growth in analytics, there is both a concern and an interest in how asset valuation practices may change in the near future without necessarily one having to suffer a climatic impact. So there is a very keen interest to take this as an opportunity to position portfolios and balance sheets ahead of that potential correction in the pricing of assets. So Dana, let me stop there if you had any follow-up question.
Yeah, no, actually, just to follow up, because you mentioned the kind of lack of predictability with physical risk and how we can integrate that in the analysis. How do you see the balance between preparing for physical risk and transition risk? Because perhaps with transition risk, there is a little bit more predictability because regulation is something that we can plan ahead, a kind of change in prices. And there is clearly a trade-off between the two, because the faster we transition, the kind of lower the physical risk likelihood is, but kind of it can be also a question of financial instability if you do it too quickly. So how do we find the balance between these two? That would be one question, and kind of how we can account for transition risk as well, because it's all well to say we need to align investments in the private sector, but at the same time, a very quicker way to act, maybe to just for governments to regulate and change prices, can be a way to introduce higher levels of transition risk, but ultimately lower physical risks sooner.
Absolutely great question, Dana. And in essence, is the same answer. So basically, transition risk and physical climate risk are completely different animals. For transition risk or mitigation, we have well understood risk return profiles. For resilience, it's not about a revenue stream, it's about protecting cash flows, and it's about avoiding costs. So it's very, very challenging to, at this initial stage, I mean, in the mid and long run, we certainly need to bring them together. But at this stage, physical climate risk, we consider that are more acutely mispriced. Because they are more challenging to integrate, and we all struggle to integrate these very considerations. We have this as a risk pricing consideration, and understand that the mispricing or the market failure in the interpretation of data into the pricing is at the heart of the challenge here. So once we properly price, there's basically nothing to discuss about in physical climate risk, whereas with transition, we will always have associated economic models and associated economic sectors that will always drive that into the future. So that is the first consideration. And actually, in how we integrate the two, it's ironically or in a very counterintuitively way, by working exclusively on physical climate risk, we think that is the best way to support transition and mitigation. And why is that? Because we believe that one of the reasons why the mitigation global agenda or transition risk agenda has not taken its absolute full potential speed is because we are still struggling to visualize how inviable certain futures are from a physical impact standpoint. And we believe that by supporting the global climate agenda in that regard, to really put in a price tag to say, no, we are not saying that you can be resilient in any future state of the world. We are saying that you can be resilient in a state of the world that combines a very aggressive mitigation and transition risk agenda. So again, we believe that by working exclusively on physical climate risk is how we help the most on transition risk in that regard. But in the future, again, and to finalize, it is absolutely true that the two need to go hand in hand, because of course, we cannot just make certain highly polluting sectors or infrastructure types to be resilient and therefore viable into the long run.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That's I think, a big topic that we can go into in the discussion as well. Let me move to you, Jose Maria, now, and perhaps also following from what has been discussed about this kind of tension or perhaps need for complementarity between mitigation and adaptation strategies also for climate change, and the role that infrastructure can play there. How, what should be the focus of investments, not just on green infrastructure and the kind of transition to a low carbon form of economy, but also resilient infrastructure to withstand the realization of the physical risks that are undoubtedly growing, and we are seeing the data around increased frequency of disasters and long-term climate change that are affecting infrastructure assets, especially in Europe, where a lot of that is old. I mean, Spain stands out in the context of Europe in terms of its infrastructure quality and investments. But how do you see that balance between resilience and kind of sustainable infrastructure?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure really to be here. And maybe before I start, I have to say that COP26 will be an enormous opportunity for the UK to make progress. For us, COP25, which came out of the blue as almost by chance, it was an extraordinary opportunity to accelerate and to move faster. As I always say, in 1 month we achieved something in terms of moving the Spanish banking sector forward that would have taken normally 2 years of dialogue. So It's an enormous opportunity, and the
yes, I remember in that little tent in the conference center last year, Jose Maria, where we met, and you had this signing with all the banks. It was all over the TV. It was this wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, United Nations, UNEP, tell us that we are one of the few banking sectors that, as a whole, as a banking sector, has taken this type of, very clear compromise of the sustainability agenda objectives. So that's something that was achieved because of COP25, very clearly. But let me now turn to your question. I think that someone before said that we are learning by doing. I think that we are all learning by doing, and one of the problems that we have is that things are accelerating very fast. Everybody's moving in an incredible speed, right now. I mean, COP25 was 1 year ago. I cannot think that it was just 1 year ago because it looks like a decade. Also because in COVID times, time goes, is lower than in normal times. So that's a fact of life now. But in terms of progress, we are making a lot of progress. And there, we need, to think very fast and to have clarity of what are we trying to achieve. And here, one of the things that worry me of late, I would say, is that we are talking a lot about, green infrastructures, which is fundamental. But within the concept of green infrastructure, we should also include, resilient infrastructures. And let me be very clear, we are now, we have now a greater chance to succeed in terms of fighting against climate change that we had 1 year ago. Very clearly, we are making progress. But the second message is that doesn't matter how fast we go, the reality is that we are going to deal with some, physical risk coming from climate change. We are in a mitigating scenario. We are not in a scenario of stopping climate change. We are in a scenario of mitigating the impact that climate change is going to have. And climate change is going to occur. We cannot avoid that. And in that respect, and I think that that's a lot of the things that we are discussing is in the hands of governments, because they need to give clarity. And one of the things that we need to understand better, is not just to having, green infrastructures, but also resilient infrastructures that can cope with the challenges that we are going to have in terms of impact of climate change in the next decade. Do
you think we're doing enough there? For example, when you look at Spain, kind of what analysis has been done in terms of these are the risks that we are going to face, this is how we are adapting our infrastructure for it, and how do you see that happening?
I think that we need to pay a greater attention to resilience. I think that we are more on analyzing, what type of projects, public infrastructure, private projects that can help in terms of fighting against climate change, but we also need to think about, what type of infrastructure we need. We are talking about energy grid, but also we are talking about water distribution, for instance. It's another area that is extremely relevant going forward because of the physical impact of climate change. And how can we make those infrastructure more resilient to the impact of climate change is something that we need to do a better job, frankly speaking. But I think that it has to be governments, not just the Spanish government, European governments, the US now that is joining, the group again. I think that we need to pay attention to that because that's an element that is extremely relevant going forward.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it's good that you mentioned the role of governments because that was also very much subject of the first panel, kind of how do we find the right approach there between bringing the private sector together, but also the governments. And something that we've talked about before, Jose Maria, is also the role of central banks. And they kind of are somewhere in the middle there because they are not democratically elected. They have that kind of not short-term horizon. They can't look ahead. They don't have that timing consistency, which helps with something like climate change. They also have very powerful tools and they are very close to the financial sector. We heard from Lord Mayor in the beginning about what Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, is doing, and Mark Carney has been referenced many times. How do you see some of the regulation that's coming from central banks, for example, the climate stress test? And the Banco de España is also very active in this. It is a member of the NGFS, and it has done quite a lot of work on the financial stability implications. How do you see the role there? And also for greening finance and infrastructure as an asset class is something that's part of that remit as well.
I think that the Lord Mayor said that we need to move from a strategy to execution. So having best cases or best practitioners or leading by example is not enough. We need to improve the average. So to do that, we need to move really to execution. And for execution, I think that what we need to ask governments, I would put them in three areas. Governments, central banks, I include central banks in government in that respect. I think that we need clarity. We need clarity of what do we need to measure, how we measure that, when we need to move forward in terms of measurement. I think there is still a lot of, there's a lot of activity, but we need a little bit a roadmap. I could say Bank of Spain, Basel Committee, which by the way is chaired by the governor of the Bank of Spain. I think that we need a little bit more of clarity. It's not just the taxonomies, it's also, for stress tests, what are the preferred, approaches to dealing with climate stress test. I think that this type of details, we need to move forward, because with so much activity, if someone like central banks, supervisors, regulators, do not give a little bit of clarity, we will end up with a lot of confusion. The other area I would say that governments and central banks need to promote is this public-private partnership. Public investment is never going to be enough. So we need to think about how we can structure that, public-private type of partnership, so that, we can have a strong leverage of what is, public money or public regulation. Does not need to be public investment. It can be a good public regulation. Is probably even better than public investment. And I think that for that, we need a little bit of clarity. Post-COVID times, we are all going to be, burdened with public debt coming from the impact on the real economy that we are seeing. So going forward, we need to be more imaginative on things that need to be done in that respect. But I think that to answer your question very clearly, what I ask regulators and central banks, greater clarity. Is not enough. What do you think about the impact of physical risk on your balance sheet? Well, yes, I can tell you, but what about you? What do you think as a regulator, as a central bank? What do you think that we should be doing to tackle this? There's a little bit, now, a lot of activities. I want a little bit more of coordination with it, that huge activity that we are seeing.
Thank you. Yes, and a lot of work is going there. I mean, at the Sustainable Policy Institute, we have these roundtables with central banks all the time, and kind of devising these stress tests, having very clear parameters in terms of what, how these can be passed or not, and clearly some central banks are already introducing that. I think we are on the way there. I'll move to you, Esteban, now, and Jose Maria already started introducing this idea of standards, and how do you see that being applied in the area of infrastructure? We spoke about sustainable infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. How do we have common framework and common standards for that? We heard earlier in the previous panel from Matthew about the work on electric vehicle ready roads and so on. We heard now about the need to also think about water distribution and other sides of infrastructure, and also come from the kind of very technical finance side, how the structuring of these projects works. Tell us a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dana, and I think it's I echo the other speakers' kind of sentiment. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. So I think there is probably a kind of a step back consideration, which is people talk very kind of freely about sustainable finance, so green infrastructure, financing green and sustainable infrastructure. But the reality is the asset class is very, very heterogeneous, right? So I think a lot of people historically think you're just talking about project finance style, long-term stable cash flows. And I think the reality of trying to deploy capital in the space is that actually it's a very heterogeneous sector. And therefore, it's quite hard to start thinking about putting what we define as global standards. Because there is a huge amount of kind of complexity in terms of how you structure particular investments in different types of infrastructure. They're very different approaches. I think one of the interesting things, and maybe we'll talk about this later on, is kind of the emergence of new kind of innovative, different types of infrastructure kind of plays. And the difficulty in shifting from taking a long-term cash flow point of view at a particular expected set of returns, with actually dealing with a very different kind of commercial reality on the ground in terms of some of these infrastructure projects. So I think it's very difficult to talk about these topics on a kind of standards basis, because at the structuring level, you have very different risk returns, you have very different types of project structurings, you have lots of different pockets of capital chasing different types of returns within that sort of landscape.
Do you think that's a particular issue for green and sustainable infrastructure specifically, or for infrastructure and asset class, or saying how the kind of conventional expectation for stable returns, that's something that does not green infrastructure, is newer, or how do you see the evolution of that?
Sorry, you cut off a little bit there, but I think the gist of your question I got. So I think it's a broader question for infrastructure as an asset class, but I think the emergence of new technologies and new green asset classes is bringing some of that complexity, because there's been a journey from again what I referred to as steady, non-merchant risk kind of cash flows that people would associate with traditional infrastructure projects to something that's actually quite different. So when you put the layer of green infrastructure and you add the layer of innovation that we've seen in the market, you bring additional complexity to what historically a lot of people have said in the past. Well, infrastructure projects, there's some basic parameters that you think about, and once you work within those parameters, you can very quickly address or assess what level of capital and what capital providers you can go to. I think the landscape today is very, very different, and therefore it's a lot harder to create that sort of kind of homogeneous set of standards and I guess definitions that people can refer to. Yeah. And I think just to finish on that point, that there's the difference again between looking at green infrastructure from an ESG integration point of view, which is about risk mitigation, versus effectively taking more of a thematic approach and an alpha generation or alpha seeking kind of view of the world. And I certainly think that we need to do a lot more in actually ensuring we have clear policy signals that then can drive capital to basically chase the alpha generation piece rather than just the pure risk mitigation piece as well.
Thank you, Esteban. And a reminder also to our audience to start sending through your questions. We also have the panelists from the first panel still on the line with us. So if you have questions for anyone who spoke so far today, please start sharing your questions through the system, and we'll ask them to the panelists. But yeah, it would be great to follow up on the discussion we had with Jose Maria as well on the importance of public-private partnerships and kind of where do you stand on that? Because how can these two pockets of capital interact? What is the role of the private sector? This was also the theme of the first panel. Where do you see the balance there?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. And from my point of view, I think the role of public capital, the role of public involvement has to come through two areas. One we've discussed, I think, at length in the panel today, which is around the policy signals. So investors trying to make long-term investment decisions need a reasonably clear kind of policy framework, and policy signals are very, very important. I think in the last 12 months, actually, we were talking about the development and the progress we made since COP25. I think there's been, when we try and map out the different jurisdictions and the level of policy kind of signals, it's that there's a lot of momentum. So I think even if everything is not completely clear, you'll probably be able to start framing some decisions around the pretty supportive policy framework kind of environment. The second one is the use of public capital, right? And I think it's very, very important, as Felipe was saying earlier, that the role of capital is to crowd in rather than crowd. I always see public capital as playing a role which is around doing two things. One is elements where the private market is today unwilling to take for different reasons, and it could be technology risk, it could be jurisdictional risk. So it's an element of underwriting some of that risk, but I think more importantly, it's about effectively creating an ecosystem which is conducive to private capital emerging and scaling up. So some of the conversations we have, for example, here in the UK with people like the British Business Bank is around how do you ensure that you actually create a catalyst for innovation at the institutional investment side. So how can you help emerging asset managers who may have issues like first-time fund issues in terms of raising institutional capital, who may actually have an angle around themes which is more relevant to some of the kind of emerging infrastructure ecosystem? How can you make sure that you use that sort of public pockets of capital to help scale and create more of a track record in the private sector that then helps unleash private capital, institutional capital into the space? So I think that sort of a scale up rather than just lowering cost of capital is a pretty important role of the public sector.
Thank you, Esteban. And let's move back to you, Felipe, actually, because we are talking about the role of the public sector and how can we ensure that aligning these incentives and kind of setting up that umbrella and framework that Esteban was talking about just now results in not just moving capital to projects that would have happened anyway, but that concept of additionality to actually do more than we would have done, not just create more favorable conditions for what we are already doing. How do you see that? And we spoke earlier with Carlos as well about this kind of the role of data and how that is creating new options now, because perhaps in the past, it would have been easier for any investor, any asset owner who wants to get into this space to say, okay, we're going to exclude certain assets or sectors from our portfolio. And we heard from your colleague from the EBRD, Matthew, earlier, that kind of coal is something that has been excluded, but at the same time, there's also some focus on transition. So how do you think about this in terms of, is it going to be easier to focus more on transition going forward because of the better data that we have, and not just do the easy option, which maybe invest in what we would have already invested in or divest from something that is very straightforward?
Thank you for this excellent question. I mean, it is at our heart in EBRD because we were born as a private sector development bank, and we are every day struggling with additionality. But it is a tense equilibrium that we try to maintain every day. How do we deal with this in practice? What we usually are at the forefront of innovation in terms of financial products, which is something that our previous speakers also brought to the table. I mean, this makes us on the safe side that whenever we are opening markets, we are being additional. We don't usually participate whenever we are financing infrastructures, not only with our supranationals, but we try to crowd in the private sector. So we put ourselves a limit in the intervention whenever we finance infrastructure projects. And we try to help in giving the appropriate signs, which is something that has been brought up also by previous speakers in this panel, so that whenever EBRD or other supranationals take part in financing tickets of a project, this is a sign for the private sector in the future that we will be there. This is obviously very tricky, and it is very complex. We see that day to day also to the process of coordinating all of us as supranationals in the green agenda, because we are doing our best in offering standards in terms of green impact of our projects, in terms of measuring Paris alignment, which is something that the EBRD, which with other supranationals, is working tough now. And you know, there is a balance there in respecting what every supranational thinks about sustainability and resilience for the future, and also of the pressing need that the private sector is asking us to give the lead and to offer some kind of common framework whereby everybody could have a benchmark of what is resilience, what is environmental impact.
And to what extent do you think, you mentioned you're working with other supranationals that work perhaps in very different contexts, different continents. To what extent do you think we should aim to have more consistency of these frameworks and these standards? And to what extent do you think they should be adapted more to local context? Because is complete consistency the aim here, or should we also take account of some nuances that different markets have perhaps? And as EBRD, where you operate in very different kinds of countries, how do you see that in practice and in the different countries that you work with?
It is pretty tricky I would say in two senses. First, because there is a pressing need, and we heard that this today. So it is not about avoiding, but it is more about building better and building resilient infrastructure. So it is excellent if we can coordinate, but if not, and in the way of coordinating, we should go ahead and do our best with the toolkit that we already have in place. And on the other hand, I would say that we do our best to coordinate among countries of operations. But as you well said, Dana, it is obviously difficult for the EBRD to play a role here because we have very diverse regions where to play. And it is even more a thrust in terms of coordinating all our supranationals that we have activity all over the world. Having said that, it is true that we have come up with solutions that we are comfortable and we offer to the outside world in terms of green footprint of our investments, which we measure on an annual basis, and in terms, as I said, on our contribution to the work that is being done to measure Paris alignment in the investment effort.
Thank you, Felipe. And let me turn to you, Carlos, because let's go back to this question from the audience on kind of where is the return coming from? And in the case of infrastructure particularly, to what extent do we think of it as a hedging risk type of investment? We heard also from Jose Maria about the importance of investing in resilient infrastructure. To what extent do we see it as a way to make returns and kind of focusing more on the opportunity? And especially as what we see now in the post-COVID times is also this increased realization from investors of these non-financial types of risk to become systemic and cascade through so many areas of the portfolios. I mean, COVID is a non-financial source of risk that has caused so many and affected so many sectors in unexpected ways. And with climate, perhaps we can understand and the framework can be a little bit more known, but it's still a very similar parallels in terms of a non-financial source of risk becoming systemic. So how do you think about that?
Thank you, and great question. So let me cover two blocks there, because I think that the systemic risk consideration is quite an important one and a standalone. But as per the question as where the returns and the opportunity comes from, there's certainly an element of hedging and assuming a continuation of valuation practices and how cost of capital and regulation is going to keep. But as we see that evolution combined with the growth of analytics, apart from the hedging, there is more of like a direct arbitrage opportunity, and that is the key driver for action that we are seeing more broadly. And I think that this may be more applicable directly to more other asset classes such as listed equity, but certainly in the infrastructure and real asset space, we are seeing that. So basically relying on how the valuation of certain assets, how cost of capital is going to adjust and recognize the real exposure of those future cash flows to physical climate risk and taking early action in that regard. As per the second consideration about systemic risk, I think that it's something that is quite important to also bring back to the discussion, as it's been discussed by the first panel and elements of the second panel, and that is to really help governments to understand what is the systemic exposure, what is the exposure of economic and social value and relevant time horizons, and not only showing them a scary map, but helping them to manage that and to alleviate that exposure, and that, in a way with a quote unquote promise that will have an implication on sovereign default risk and sovereign ratings. And I think that is critical, again, to bring together the public and the private. And we need to be recognizing that we respond to different drivers, and there are different incentives for public and private actors. But when it comes to physical climate risk, there's certainly a joint element between the two. I just want to finish very quickly with a point that has been made about the critical importance of practicality. And I think that is absolutely fundamental within the coalition, the CCRI, which is also a COP26 flagship initiative. We're working with 40 real projects where we have real data, real cash flow models, real engineering studies, and we're working with 6 climate risk data providers that are delivering a pro bono assessment of risk. And then we're working with 25 leading institutions in redefining those cash flow models. And then everything is going to be brought together in what we are starting to shape as the League of Investment Funds for Resilience. So just maybe a little bit of a shameless plug, but certainly adding to what's been an important consideration. But overall, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. That's great. Jose Maria, we've spoken a lot about the standards, the data. You spoke about this as well, the role of governments, of central banks. You as in your role with the Spanish Banking Association, what do you think the balance is between what banks and financial institutions are doing themselves and waiting for the regulation to come? So what we are seeing in a lot of the conversations that we are having is that if the progress is too slow from the regulators and government side in setting up a taxonomy, private sector are going to do that by themselves because the risk incentive is so strong. So does that create a risk of everyone's going to set up their own standards if we don't do that fast enough? Do you think the progress from the regulators is coming fast enough? Because we heard about the role of ratings agencies. They're doing a lot to reflect that in their assessments. And we've also seen, for example, from asset managers, everyone setting up their own platforms, their own technologies of showing how you can integrate ESG in different ways, how you can manage risk. So how do you see that developing?
Well, very clearly, I mean, banks cannot wait. Banks cannot wait, not just because, I mean, of some type of superior objective that they have, it's because, if you don't move soon, you are going to be out of business soon as well. So for us, it's very clear. It's not a question of trying to comply with nice international standards. It's about surviving as a bank. So we cannot wait. That's the first message. Second message, you're right. I mean, what is the risk? That we are making so much progress that I fear a little bit that we may end up with all types of standards. I don't think that the problem right now is, for instance, on the area of disclosure is greenwashing. I don't think that the problem is greenwashing. I think that the problem is that you have very heterogeneous disclosure terms, by banks or between a bank and an insurance company and a pension fund and an asset manager. I think that is really the risk. The risk is heterogeneity of approaches. And my last word, I think that I cannot see the regulators, as being contrarians to all this world. I think that I see no contradiction between green and brown factors and, risk-weighted asset methodology as defined in the Basel Committee. I think that we have two problems. We have a problem of a knowledge gap, all of us, and we need to fill it in. And we have a problem of time frame, that the type of risk we are considering, first, they occur in a longer time frame than the usual risk that, banking regulation deals with. And the other one is that even that longer time frame is very uncertain. Maybe longer means, a couple of years, 3 years. So that's a little bit, my fear. That's why I'm calling on governments, on regulators to really move fast and try to accelerate, what they are doing. Because, the problem is not that we are going to stop and do nothing. No, the problem, we are going to go ahead and we will have, a very confusing, landscape. And progress will be, more limited if we have that confused landscape.
Thank you. And we have 15 minutes left for this panel. So I'm now going to invite the panel one as well to join to answer all the audience's question. But one question for you to stay with you, Jose Maria, actually, is on the upcoming green bond that Spain will be issuing. I don't know how closely involved you've been with that. We've heard from Lord Mayor earlier about the UK's plans for a green bond issuance. How involved have you been in this? What do you expect to happen? What are the challenges that have been as part of that? It's Spain entering this group of countries issuing sovereign green bonds in terms of defining the pipeline and also execution.
I think that the key element there for a government green bond or for a private green bond is traceability of use of resources. I think that is the key element. If you ask me, I started my life as a public sector economist, specialized in the public sector. So for me, the challenge for the public sector is that in principle, all government debt, is there to finance, the gap between government revenues and expenditures. And the challenge for all of us, which is traceability, is going to be even greater for government. So we talk about greenwashing. That's a risk for the private sector. That's also a risk for the government sector. And I think that they need to be very, very clear on disclosure of information, on traceability of uses, so that nobody has a doubt that, what you are doing is really, up to the standards that you are committed to. I think that's the key element for me.
Thank you. Okay, let's ask a question from the audience then to move to the whole panel. So let's move back to you, Matthew. And there is a question about how can governments and central banks ensure for investors that green products are not less profitable than regular products? And that's something that you as an issuer as well perhaps are facing in terms of what is the incentive for issuing green products? What is the incentive for issuers, for investors? Is there still that lack of understanding that green is perhaps something that we have to sacrifice return for? We spoke about it being something that is perhaps risk hedging, is something that we have to pay a price for. On the other hand, we also hear arguments that actually it's not the green products that are more expensive, as the brown products are priced wrong and should have a different price. So it's a market failure question as well. How do you see that question?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the first thing to say is this is I consider one of these mega trends now. It is becoming really a mainstream type of investment. It's the forward-looking, future-proof types of investments. This is why EBRD has upped the ante, as I said, on our green economy transition to 50% plus, within the next few years. I would say, I just wanted to quickly comment, I think there needs to be more robustness in the market with regard to sustainable infrastructure indicators. And we're working actually with other MDBs on a consolidated set to provide some thought leadership around this. A consolidated set, there are various initiatives, but we're trying to get a critical mass of the MDBs together to work on a smaller set of where the coincidence of thought comes together, a consensus around this, and then put that out to the market so that they can actually, sort of get behind something that the majority of the MDBs have said is part of sustainable infrastructure in terms of data and indicator and qualities of those investments. I think the other thing to say from a private sector investor standpoint, our investors actually know that this is what they should be doing, what they want to be doing. There are profits to be made here. I mean, I look in the area of urban investments, the whole conversion to green infrastructure at the urban level. This is a big area. There's a linkage to digital as well, smart and green there. And we see very interesting developments in this area of partnering with the private sector. So yeah, I don't see them, I don't see this as sort of this barrier any longer. I think this is what investors now realize is what they need to be involved in, and particularly in the emerging markets, I would add.
Thank you, very useful. I'll just now to close would like to ask the same question to all of you as is typical of these panels. Kind of if you had a magic wand to boost green infrastructure investment, both resilient and sustainable infrastructure, what would you do? So Matthew, let's start with you.
What would I agree? Yeah, magic wands are nice things to have. Probably I think these kind of internal institutional commitments are important. I think the consensus around, Paris alignment, I think, is tremendously important now. We've got new impetus now with the change in administration in the US. I think, as I said, I'm speaking from an MDB's perspective. When a critical mass of the MDBs come together around something, it's very powerful. And that's our strength when we act sort of more as a system rather than as individual, especially from the policy standpoint. So I think the magic wand for me was if we can get critical mass of MDBs around this, it will help a lot in emerging markets.
Thank you. Let's move to your colleague, Felipe. What's your magic wand answer?
Yeah, I can follow closely Matthew in this. I think there is a lot of effort and good work being invested in this coordination among MDBs. And I would underline the work that we are conveying, the Paris alignment work. So I hope that when the result comes, that this is a positive incentive and a catalyzer for private funds coming to fund infrastructure.
Thank you, Felipe. Rafaela, you've had to reflect on all the discussions we've had in the second panel as well. Anything you want to add, and also what would you do from tomorrow to really boost infrastructure investment. You have in your chapter a whole table about the risks linked to infrastructure assets and kind of technical and political and so on. So what do you think is the priority to really get things off the ground?
I think if I can use the magic wand twice, if you allow me, briefly, I would say two priorities. One is bringing a new approach to infrastructure investment, which means a systemic approach, life cycle, long-term horizon. This is needed on the public sector side and the private sector side, linking sustainability and resilience. If you do that, the alignment gets much closer between investors, private sector, and public sector in the first place. And the same approach needs to be taken into the analysis of data. And this is a backward-looking and forward-looking analysis of scenarios analysis, getting out to the policy objectives that Paris Agreement forced us to do. And a big potential leverage could be the regulators. Raul spoke before about Basel. The same is true about solvency from the insurance side, the risk-weighted assets, the risk we're attaching to the different transition and physical risks, and what is infrastructure? Infrastructure is in the first place from a financial market perspective. Where does it sit? On this has been FSB work in the past, not just Kearney, but also work on infrastructure per se as an asset class. We can build on that work done 2 years ago. There is new data coming out. There is an interest from investors to disclose data if they get the right answer to the major questions they have. So there is a big opportunity out there, and I think the time is great now to get in this space between public and private sector.
Thank you, Raffaele. Raul, on your side, Raffaele referenced your focus also on the regulations and the disclosures as well. What would you do if you had a magic wand?
Well, I would say, first of all, again, the taxonomy, which is critical. And this is the journey from the taxonomy, green, brown, and non-classified towards risk-weighted assets, because it does affect banks and insurance companies, Basel and Solvency, just in a nutshell. Secondly, as an urgent measure as well for regulators to improve the current framework of securitization for significant risk transfer, and also the current SDS framework, standardized, transparent. So this SDS framework for securitization as well, which is critical, and the link of that with sustainable finance. That's what I would say without doubt. And finally, that I really think the sustainable finance agenda from a regulatory point of view has to be driven by the market, not by the politics.
Thank you, Raul. What's your view on this, Jose Maria, and what would you do?
Sorry?
You are on mute.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm going to use it as well twice. I would say the first one is clarification of concepts. What, which is the taxonomy, but also how we can measure those risk, and when we should start, to take action. So clarification of concepts is the first one. Second one is governments agreeing around this concept. Because let's not fool ourselves. I mean, we are now in a much better scenario post US elections, but there's a big risk that we may end up with green trade wars if the big economic blocs do not agree, not just on moving forward, but on how we should move forward. I think that second element, is extremely important, and it's a real risk. These green trade wars are a real risk. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. And I think everyone's getting very excited about the positive direction that the US is taking. And we didn't get to talk about this very much because we were focusing more on the UK and Spain, but it will be a very big game changer in the next 4 years in terms of how that is affecting the direction we're taking. But certainly Asia and Europe have been more advanced, and standard setting in that area is very important. So thanks for raising this. Mike, over to you. What would you do to boost sustainable infrastructure?
Thank you. Clearly, I'd like to move my magic wand twice as well, if that's okay. So there have been a number of comments here, which I absolutely agree with. Just going back to the research we did in July, for the 1,000 projects that we looked at, finance is only one aspect of what was holding those projects back. So if you look at about 490 of those, the main barrier was non-financial. So I think we as an industry in financial services, we understand, and Rael's point around taxonomy, I think is absolutely critical. We need to address the regulatory and the policy environment to be able to provide an environment that is conducive to the type of investment to be able to support this. There is an awareness and understanding that this is important, but also I think we need to provide an environment that is encouraging the type of investment that's required. And then my second magic wand then goes back to transparency. So if we encourage through a taxonomy, through the ability for organizations to have some predictability and clarity as to how they report, and that the consumers of that have a clear understanding of what they are consuming and how that data is being put together, that is key. One of the challenges we've got, I think that we now have roughly one for every day of the year, a different standard for reporting around ESG. I think there are around about 360 different standards for reporting. That's not sustainable. So the work we're doing with WEF and the other accounting firms and with the Bank of America is critical, because that provides a standard that we as consumers of that for financial services, but also for people who are providing those disclosures, have a standard that they can start working to. That has to be the way that we move forward. That's the magic wand, to get consistency, simplicity, and consistency across the different sectors and across the different geographies.
Great, thank you. Esteban.
Oh, hi. So I've got also a couple of themes. So the first one is just around getting, as an investor, and thinking both short-term and long-term, is getting very clear kind of policy signals. And that's primarily around pricing externalities. And I think the way I look at this is, if you have clear policy signals, you're going to be able to achieve two things. On the one side is drive long-term capital to support long-term projects. And then on the other side is have policy signals in terms of supporting emerging managers to channel private capital and facilitate scaling private capital to emerging infrastructure technologies. So I think the whole innovation piece around the supply chain of sustainable infrastructure is going to be pretty critical. So match long-term capital with long-term investors through long-term clear policy signals, and effectively encourage the growth of emerging managers to basically cater for the more innovative technologies that have a slightly different risk profile.
Great, thank you. Long-term is the key word of the day. Carlos, last but not least.
Thank you very much. And let me first endorse everything that has been said. Absolutely fantastic wish list. So I'm only going to add one, and kind of also resonated with a lot of that has been said about transparency and consistency. But on the climate risk analytics side, I think that it would be fantastic that without, being too naive in hoping to eliminate uncertainty, but that we squeeze that a range of uncertainty that is making the interpretation of climate risk data so challenging in terms of cash flow modeling. And for that, there is an element of transparency, agreement of open source considerations that to some players is a little bit of a sensitive, but only we have that agreed upon a consistent approach to analytics, we can then progress into the proper integration. But I will leave it there just in the interest of time, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you, everyone. We've covered a lot of ground today, some key takeaways. We know COVID has sharpened our awareness that we are so vulnerable to non-financial sources of risk, investing for that, understanding both the physical and the transition risks, how to manage them, how we can invest not just in sustainable future, but also in resilience against some of these risks is very important. We've spoken about the role of governments and regulators in setting standards and creating common frameworks, but also in setting an environment for the private sector to also complement what is doing. Infrastructure is an asset class that requires very long-term vision, requires scale. Public sector has a big role to play there, but at the same time, you need to bring the private sector and private finance along the way. Transparency, standards, disclosures have been words that have been repeated again and again in our discussion today, and a lot of work has gone into this. Thank you very much to all of you. I'd now like to hand over for closing remarks to His Excellency the Ambassador of the UK to Spain, Hugh Elliott. who has been ambassador since 2019, following a long career at the FCO here in the UK, in the communication side, in focusing on Europe. We last met in December at the COP, and so much has changed since then, as we've heard throughout the discussion today. So thank you very much for joining us and for hosting this event with us.
Hello, Danae. It's very nice to be with you. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Yep. Great. Well, look, thank you so much, first of all, to all the participants. Of course, I'm grateful to the Lord Mayor for opening up today, but I've been listening to quite a lot of this conversation, and I'm incredibly impressed by the engagement and the expertise of all the participants in the panels. And to be quite honest, my brain's hurting a little bit, because this is clearly a very complex as well as a vital area. Now, just to start off, I suppose, and you've all been sort of sitting looking at a screen for quite a long time, so I won't go on for long at all. Rest assured, this will be fairly brief. But to reiterate, thanks very much, everybody. Great panel discussions, great chairing, if I may say, Danae, moderating. You did an absolutely superb job, and I might also add that perhaps we need a bit more gender diversity in some of the voices we have talking about this. But I thought you did an absolutely brilliant job and helped me, as did all the panelists, understand some of the big challenges that we've got here. And the proximity, you'd expect me to say this as a bilateral ambassador, I suppose, but the proximity of the relationships between our two countries, but our two economies, just makes us natural partners to be talking about and driving this debate. And the UK last year, topped the list of foreign direct investment flows into Spain at 4.9 billion. The UK has long been at the top of the list of Spanish foreign investment. I won't go into all the bilateral statistics, you know it pretty well, but just to say that our relationship is incredibly close. When you add to that the proximities of our COP25 and COP26, not quite as close as we'd hope, but almost as close, then I think we've got a huge amount in common. It's clearly a complex area, as you've just summed up there, Danae. The range of different things that need to be resolved rapidly, the clarity that needs to be brought to this agenda. It's fascinating to hear the different ideas, thoughts, all the different proposals from the magic wand that has been waved on this in that final part of the discussion. And I think there are several things that are actually playing to our advantage here. First would be the fact that this is moving very fast. As Jose Maria, I think you said, COP25 was an incredible catalyst for action within Spain. And I think COP26 absolutely is being the same for us. And maybe it's an advantage that is extending to a 2-year period in which the entire large amounts of the public sector system in the UK is thinking about all the issues around the challenges of climate change, and green finance absolutely central to the list. You've heard the Lord Mayor talk about the UK's sovereign green bond. We're talking about the possibilities for Spain. We've got a mandate for large companies and financial services to report impact on climate by 2025. And we absolutely take on board the need for a new green taxonomy, which several of you have highlighted. I can completely see, having worked in the private sector, how you really need to understand the regulatory and risk framework of this and have a common set of understandings about it in order to be able to drive the investment that we really need to drive here. So the COP proximity is accelerating our focus, but COVID is as well. I mean, it's put our systems and societies under so much strain, but it's also, it's driven really home to us the interdependence between our systems and the health of the planet. And so I think it makes it far harder for the head in the sand approach to be seen really anywhere as an appropriate response to what is going on. So completely understand the calls for clear policy signals, public sector signals at a national basis. You know, we have been trying to do that. We've launched our 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which we hope will mobilize around £12 billion on top of the £5 billion already announced in the UK for a green recovery. And I think, so at a macro level, I think you're beginning to see those clear policy signals. What I'm hearing is you need much more micro clarity. We're never, as somebody just said, you know, we're never going to eliminate uncertainty. If you eliminated uncertainty, then it would be very boring to be in business. But we do certainly need to reduce it and to increase clarity and transparency. And I think you have highlighted very helpfully for us the priorities in that respect. So I will just finish up here by saying that you've absolutely got our commitment from the British Embassy team. I'm very grateful to my own team, Michelle in particular, also of course to OMFIF for hosting this, and grateful to all the panelists. We will continue to work on this. This is going to be very high up our agenda. We've got a lot of work to do, but it is moving fast. And so that's good news. There's a lot of opportunity in this place. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Danae, again for masterly moderating.